I'd like to do something a little controversial, a little bit progressive, which is to suggest that we've come to the end of the beginning of digital media. I want to suggest that that moment of nascency, that beginning moment, that moment where digital technology has come to the museum sector for the first time, that initial phase is coming to an end. What I'd like to do in the next sort of half an hour or so is to frame a way, or suggest a way of framing digital heritage within the museum sector after the digital revolution. So this is to suggest that we've moved from a period of adoption and uptake and newness to a period where digital will become, and a word that I'm going to use quite a bit in the next half an hour, where digital has become normative and become naturalized within our museum practice, but also our museological research. I should perhaps put a health warning, a caveat, a disclaimer at the beginning of this paper. I'm certainly not suggesting that all museums have become digitized. Secondly, I'm certainly not suggesting that all museums should become digitized. What I'm presenting here is a framework for allowing us to think about the museum when digital has become embedded and normalized within our society and within many of the cultures of our visiting groups. It's based upon some research over the last year where a mixture of in-depth interviews with museum strategists and heads of new media, also looking at archival material and documentation from a number of national museums in the UK. And I should also make that clear that my examples that I've been using are specifically British examples. It's 6 national museums, and you'll see examples of those in a moment. What I'm trying to show is that in those, or what I've seen in those organizations, are traces of digital media being managed normatively. What we're seeing in those organizations is, again, interesting behavior, traces of post-digital management, of working with digital media in a post-digital way. This word post-digital also perhaps needs a very brief explanation. It can be perhaps slightly voguish and fashionable and also slightly superficial to put the word or the prefix post in front of some interesting cultural concepts as if to feign some sort of intellectual profundity. Hopefully that's not what I'm doing here. With the word post-digital, I want to signal very carefully and very specifically that we're in a different condition of digitality today. It's a state in which, rather than being a new technology and rather than being new media, digital is part normatively of our everyday lives. So it is all the qualities of digitality that we've seen in the last 10, 20, 30 years, but it's been augmented, it's extended in some way. Our relationship with digital, because it's become familiar, is now different. And that post-prefixed, post-digital, hopefully signals all of that. This is where we're going to finish in about 25 minutes' time. This is the final slide. So this is the conclusion. These are the qualities I'd like to propose, very tentatively, of the post-digital museum. So we'll begin to see how these statements make sense as descriptors of post-digitality. For about 40 years, museum professionals and museologists have been thinking about today, have been thinking about what it would be like to be in a museum that is digitized. Here's William Paisley from Stanford University back in 1968, and he's standing up at an event very similar to this 45 years ago, describing what it would be like sometime in 1980, future, what it would be like to go to a museum and encounter digital things. So a visitor encountering a digital kiosk and being able to mine the museum for digital information. This is his vision of our present that was his future. Everett Ellen was one of the individuals, along with Jack Heller from New York University, that established the Museum Computer Network in the US, again, back in the late 1960s. At a very similar time, this is Ellen describing what might happen with digital technology in the future. We might hope to orient and serve the museum visitor in a variety of modes keyed under computer control to individual requirements. Again, this sense that we'd be supporting the visitor in a multi-channel and ambient digital way. These visions of a digital future, of a museum in which digital becomes normative and is just an embedded function of the museum, continue through the 1970s and 1980s in the museum computing literature. Philip Humphrey is writing in 1967 at the University of Kansas Museum of Natural History. And again, they're wondering whether perhaps someday this vision they have of digital automation will become a reality. In all of those visions, this reverie through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was of a museum institution in which digital is innate, is a function of the institution, that the museum is wired and connected, and that computing has been naturalized within the organization of the museum, but also the facilities that it offers to the visitor. I'd like to very tentatively suggest that we're at the beginning of that phase, that we're now starting today to see traces in some of our museums of that level of normativity within our digital provision, to the extent that I think we can call it post-digital framework. Normativity is a word that also perhaps deserves a footnote and an explanation. Normativity is sometimes a controversial term. It's a term that we encounter in philosophy, political philosophy, also within sort of literature and linguistics. Sometimes something that is normative can be looked at suspiciously by scholars. For instance, in the context of gender and studies around sexual identity, we might use normativity in a way that suggests that there is some sort of societal norm when it comes to gender orientation and gender identity. So sometimes normativity is a negative concept. However, in the context in which I'd like to use it, in this work, I think it can actually leave that baggage. It can leave those negative associations to one side. Because I'm suggesting that in the context of an institution, within one very specific organizational culture, to talk about normativity in that context is actually quite helpful. So what I'm suggesting, taking ideas from Behram here, 2012, is the idea that digital becomes normative. It becomes what Behram calls an institutional ought. You ought to do something. It's expected that digital is a perfectly valid, normal, everyday, non-controversial, totally orthodox way of dealing with certain parts of museum work. There's another body of literature that can also help us, that gives us another lens. So if we're trying to look at museums today, and trying to measure and understand the extent to which digital is embedded within those organizations. On the one hand, from political philosophy, we may take this idea of normativity, but from business studies, and there's some key references here, and I direct you to Wanda Orlikowski's work in particular, from business studies we get another intellectual tool. And this is a tool that helps us to think about assimilation and adoption of technology. So there's a large body of literature that's tried to understand how organizations, commercial and non-profit, have adopted and assimilated computing and new technology. There's a surprising amount of consensus I found in this particular literature, and my synthesis of this, but owing a lot to those last three references, goes something like this. Business studies helps us to see where to look. It directs us to the right places to look for examples of digital adoption. What these models of business studies tell us is, first of all, you might look at the structures of domination within a museum or another organization. You might look at the structures of legitimization, and you might look at the structures of signification. So what do these mean? Well, in terms of the structures of domination, it says, have a look at the mission statement, have a look at the vision documents of the institution, and see the extent to which the organization is reflecting digitality in those. Look at its policy, look at its protocols for working. Look at the organizational shape. Where is digital in the organization? Is it in a peripheral, specialized, marginal unit, or is it embedded? Are there digital practitioners across the institution, which would be evidence of normativity? In terms of those structures of legitimization, these are the structures within an organization which give value to digital things. So whereas the structures of domination make the institution digital, the structures of legitimization are where digital is given value within the organization. So for instance, there may be particular language and terminology that an institution uses. It might be the allocation of resources. If digital isn't scratching around for money to do things, but is core funded within the organization, that is highly significant. The skill sets that are valued within the institution, how job adverts call for digital literacy, the extent to which training is provided in the area of digital. Finally, in terms of the structures of signification, this is sort of represented in the strategic priorities. So what is important for the organization? Structures of domination is about control. Structures of legitimization is about value. And structures of signification, I guess, is about the prominence and the importance that's given to the strategic direction, is given to digital within the strategic direction of the institution. Finally, it might also be to do with the brand. It might be the extent to which digitality, connectivity, may influence the brand, the graphic identity, but also the brand values, the unique selling point of the institution itself. This is really helpful for doing research and for trying to investigate to what extent we've become digital in the museum sector. Stepping out of museum studies and stepping over into another academic discipline, in this case business studies and management studies, is really useful because it gives us the intellectual equipment to help us engage with this question. As an aside, and I've now got a footnote to my footnote, which is now turning into a very interesting postmodern piece of literature. The footnote would say, this is a wonderful characteristic of museum studies. We seem to have permission to cross borders, academic borders from subject to subject. And I think many people that you find in museology and museum studies are people who enjoy being on the margins and crossing over and being cross-disciplinary and having this freedom of movement across the academy that allows us to reach for intellectual tools from other subjects and bring them back to our project of the museum. Okay, let me now jump up my 2 levels of footnotes. These are the people that I've been spending a lot of time talking to. So they've been incredibly generous in the hours that they've given to me to talk to me, and also the access that they've given me to sometimes unpublished material, policy documents, and documents within inside their institutions. As you can see, they represent 6 national London-based and very prominent institutions in the UK. And all of these individuals have a key role in managing digital media within their organization. We might say there's a bias. We might say that they have a particular agenda. They would be, of course, advocates for digitality. But nonetheless, I think as a first attempt to start talking about post-digitality and managing digital normatively in the museum, these are very useful people to talk to, first of all. And this is what I found. First of all, it seems that in these particular institutions, we're starting to see digital being naturalized within the museum's vision and articulation of itself. What we're seeing in those institutions are museums that don't see themselves just as buildings anymore, for instance. An organization such as the Imperial War Museum, or certainly Tate, they see themselves as multi-channel. The phrase that we're hearing more and more from these organizations is that they're multi-platform organizations. We've even heard heads of marketing at some of these institutions refer to themselves as a brand, and that the museum in the 21st century is not just a place and a venue, but is an experience and a provision and a body of expertise and a collection that a visitor, stroke user, stroke learner, stroke customer might encounter in many different places, in many different spaces and timeframes. A 15-year-old boy doing his art history homework sitting in Tokyo, needing to find out the date of a particular painting, might be reassured by the fact that that information has come from Tate online and their website. At that point, it doesn't matter that that boy hasn't made his way all the way to London and walked across the threshold of Tate Modern. At that point, the museum has served its function and has supported that individual. That conception of a museum that can be everywhere for everyone in many different media, in many different modes and many different channels can only happen because of digital. So that's an example of institutions that are framing their self-identity because of digital. Another thing that we're seeing is a preparedness for a post-digital structure, which is a rather grand phrase. Let me explain what I mean. Here are some quotes. I've just anonymized them just because it's not too important who they come from. But in these quotes, we see these heads of new media talking about how they're becoming more centralized within the organizational structure, within the organogram of the institution. We're hearing conversations within these institutions now about whether they actually need to have a separate digital team. Do we actually need, in the 21st century, a director of digital? It's as if we've been on a very interesting arc. We've gone from digital media being the preserve of the IT team, and sometimes being within facilities management parts of the organization, through to digital starting to become part of a learning team. What we've tended to see in recent years is digital starting to have more associations with marketing teams, and that we start to see very prominent digital teams within these large national institutions. The next phase that many of these directors of digital are talking about is one where maybe even their job doesn't exist. That digital is so normalized within our institutional practice that we we expect there to be a digital inflection, a digital dimension to most things we do. We don't have a head of paper at our organizations. Why do we have a head of digital? At the moment, it's useful because there are things that we've been trying to work through in the digital heritage sector. There are cases and arguments to be made. There's risk assessments we've gone through. We've tried to compile case studies and evidence that can reassure us that digital genuinely adds value to our collections management, to our visitor experience, to our research. But now that that case has been made, the question is whether we need to silo and put digital in a separate place, and whether we do it a disservice if we do exactly that. And actually, the more progressive approach is to see digital right across our provision. It's a really interesting final quote, that, isn't it? In 5 years' time, the leadership of the digital space needs to be a group leadership cutting across all kinds of different areas of activity. So those are the ways in which structures of domination are very helpful in alerting us to where digital is being managed normatively. Just to look at some of those structures of legitimization. Remember, these are the places where digital is being valued within the organization. These organizations are now recruiting blended roles. So these are individuals that sit with one with one leg, one foot in the digital team and another foot within another part of the institution. Online shop managers, online research editors, digital participation officers, and so on. We're seeing in these particular institutions, and remember, I'm not saying this is happening across the sector or is happening in your institution or indeed should happen in your institution. I'm merely saying that in these institutions I've looked at, it's very interesting that we can see these sorts of blended roles. Someone who doesn't have a non-digital or a digital portfolio, but they have something that crosses the two. That suggests that digital is being valued in many, many parts of the organization if an organization starts to recruit blended roles. This sense of digital thinking is a very interesting idea. So with many of these digital teams, this particular quote comes from the wonderful National Maritime Museum, who have a very progressive and talented head of digital and design. And she talks about digital thinking being when a team is working fast and quick, ideas are seen to be permanently iterative and in beta version. This more iterative approach she talks about. What she evidences in her organization is some extraordinary moments where that way of working, that very agile way of producing things in the museum, starts to have an influence elsewhere in the organization. And she talks about how she's seen evidence of digital thinking, agile, iterative, always in beta, how that style of workflow is now being seen in other parts of the institution. But interestingly, other parts of the institution that may not be doing digital work. So a group that's developing an education pack for schools, not necessarily digital, but is being influenced by this digital way of producing things, digital production. Again, it shows that as an organization, the work of the digital team is being valued. The other interesting thing is that digital becomes part of the generative moment. Many of these heads of new media say that whereas 10 years ago they were joining exhibition design meetings at the end of the process when the exhibition was already designed and they were being asked to bolt on and add a digital element to it. Now they're being invited to the first meeting, and that moment when digital is being embedded within the design. Digital is not thought about later. It's thought about as a project is conceived. Again, the design process, the institution is valuing the importance of digital. Digital is also finding its way into many different elements of the institution. Here's, again, one of the unpublished documents from one of these national museums that actually uses the phrase post-digital. We're in this post-digital phase. This is an organization that it's no longer seeing digital production as separate from other sorts of design and production. It's just saying there is design, there is media production, and digital is just one of the tools that we can use. And sometimes we'll use it, and sometimes we won't. It will depend upon the design solution that's appropriate for what we're producing. For this particular institution, digital has been naturalized and is managed normatively. There isn't a separate digital skills team, a digital production team, or at least that's the aspiration. And finally, as you just come up to the last few minutes here, these structures of signification, remember, are the ways in which digital is seen to be important. So not domination, not the way that it's controlled in a particular area, not the value it's given, but the way that digital is seen to be important for where the institution's heading. I've talked about the strategizing for a multi-platform future, and also this sense of not needing to strategize separately for digital. Many of these digital directors are uneasy that they have to produce a separate digital strategy for their directorate or for their board of trustees. Maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was incredibly important for making the case for digital. But now it unhelpfully puts digital to one side. There should be a digital reflection within all of the strategies of the institution, rather than having a separate strategy for digital. That at least seems to be the characteristic of a post-digital museum, where digital is being managed normatively. So this is then the characteristics of what we might call the post-digital museum. And just to reiterate then my caveats and disclaimers from the very beginning. I'm not suggesting all museums should become this. I'm not suggesting that these elements are found in museums across the world today. What my research has shown is that in some institutions at the moment, we're seeing traces of digital being managed in a very naturalized way. And by looking through the lens of business studies and political philosophy, ideas of technological adoption and ideas of normativity, we get a sense of how these organizations are entering a new phase of digital management, where digital is normative. And that, I think, marks, when it comes to digital media, it marks the end of the beginning.